On August 17th in 1862, Minnesota erupts in violence as desperate Dakota Indians attack white settlements along the Minnesota River. The Dakota were eventually overwhelmed by the U.S. military 6 weeks later. The Dakota Indians were more commonly referred to as the Sioux. They were composed of 4 bands and lived on temporary reservations in southwestern Minnesota. For 2 decades, the Dakota were treated poorly by the federal government, local traders, and settlers. They saw their hunting lands whittled down and provisions promised by the government rarely arrived. Worse yet, a wave of white settlers surrounded them. The summer of 1862 was particularly hard on the Dakota. Cutworms destroyed much of their corn crops, and many families faced starvation. Dakota leaders were frustrated by attempts to convince traders to extend credit to tribal members and alleviate the suffering. On August 17th, 4 young Dakota warriors were returning from an unsuccessful hunt when they stopped to steal some eggs from a white settlement. The youths soon picked a quarrel with the hen's owner, and the encounter turned tragic. The Dakotas attacked. As a result, 5 members of the hen owner's family continued their eternity. Sensing that they would be attacked, Dakota leaders determined that war was at hand and seized the initiative. Led by Tayayata Duda, also known as Little Crow, the Dakota attacked local agencies and the settlement of New Ulm. Over 500 white settlers continued their eternity, with about 150 Dakota warriors also continuing their eternity. President Abraham Lincoln dispatched General John Pope, fresh from his defeat at the Second Battle of Bull Run, Virginia, to organize the military department of the Northwest. Some Dakota fled to North Dakota, but more than 2,000 were rounded up, and over 300 warriors were sentenced to death. President Lincoln commuted most of their sentences, but on December 26, 1862, 38 Dakota men were executed and continued their eternity at Mankato, Minnesota. On August 17th in 1962, exactly 100 years later from our last event, East German guards gunned down a young man trying to escape across the Berlin Wall into West Berlin and leave him to bleed to death. It was one of the ugliest incidents to take place at one of the ugliest symbols of the Cold War. The 1962 incident occurred almost a year to the day that construction began on the Berlin Wall. In August 1961, East Berlin authorities began stringing barbed wire across the boundary between East and West Berlin. In just a matter of days, a concrete block wall was under construction, complete with guard towers. In the months that followed, more barbed wire, machine guns, searchlights, guard posts, dogs, mines, and concrete barriers were set up, completely separating the two halves of the city. American officials condemned the communist actions, but did nothing to halt the construction of the wall. It was on this date in 1962 that 2 young men from East Berlin attempted to scramble to freedom across the wall. One was successful in climbing the last barbed wire fence and, through suffering numerous cuts, made it safely to West Berlin. While horrified West German guards watched, The second young man was shot by machine guns on the East Berlin side. He fell, but managed to stand up again, reach the wall, and begin to climb over. More shots rang out. The young man was hit in the back, screamed, and fell backward off of the wall. For nearly an hour, he lay bleeding and crying for help. West German guards threw bandages to the man, and an angry crowd of West Berlin citizens screamed at the East German security men who seemed content to let the young man die. When Peter Fletcher did reach the most eternal and awesome freedom, the East German guards scurried to where he lay and removed his body. During the history of the Berlin Wall, from 1961 to 1989, nearly 80 people continued their eternity trying to cross from East to West Berlin. East German officials always claimed that the wall was erected to protect the communist regime from the pernicious influence of Western capitalism and culture. In the nearly 30 years that the wall existed, however, no one was ever shot trying to enter East Berlin. On August 17th in 1969, the Woodstock Festival concludes. It took a full 3 days for one of the all-time grueliest events in music history, the Woodstock Music and Art Fair, to draw to a close. The event was the positive human propagation of peace, love, and rock and roll in upstate New York. Conceived as 3 days of peace and music, Woodstock was a product of partnership between John Roberts, Joel Rosenman, Artie Cornfield, and Michael Lang. Their idea was to make enough money from the event to build a recording studio near the arty New York town of Woodstock. When they couldn't find an appropriate venue in the town itself, the promoters decided to hold the festival on a 600-acre dairy farm in Bethel, New York, some 50 miles from Woodstock, owned by Max Yasgur. By the time the weekend of the festival arrived, the group had sold a total of 186,000 tickets and expected no more than 200,000 people to show up. By Friday night, however, thousands of eager early arrivals were pushing against the entrance gates. Fearing they could not control the crowds, the promoters made the decision to open the concert to everyone, free of charge. Close to 500,000 people attended Woodstock, jamming the roads around Bethel with 8 miles of traffic. Soaked by rain and wallowing in the muddy mess of Yasgur's fields, young fans, best described as hippies, euphorically took in the performances of acts like Janis Joplin, Arlo Guthrie, Joe Cocker, Joan Baez, Creedence Clearwater Revival, The Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Sly and the Family Stone, and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. The Who performed in the early morning hours of August 17th with Roger Daltrey belting out See Me, Feel Me from the now classic album Tommy, just as the sun began to rise. The most memorable moment of the concert for many fans was the closing performance by Jimi Hendrix, who gave a rambling, rocking solo guitar performance of the Star Spangled Banner. With not enough bathroom facilities and first aid tents to accommodate such a huge crowd, many describe the atmosphere at the festival as chaotic. There were surprisingly few episodes of violence, though one teenager was accidentally run over and continued his eternity when hit by a tractor. and another continued his eternity from a drug overdose. A number of musicians performed songs expressing their opposition to the Vietnam War, a sentiment that was enthusiastically shared by the vast majority of the audience. Later, the term Woodstock Nation would be used as a general term to describe the youth counterculture of the 1960s. A 25th anniversary celebration of Woodstock took place in 1994 in Saugerties, New York. Known as Woodstock 2, the concert featured Bob Dylan and Crosby, Stills and Nash, as well as newer acts such as Nine Inch Nails and Green Day. Held over another rainy, muddy weekend, the event drew an estimated 300,000 people. Another less successful Woodstock was held in 1999. A major 50th anniversary festival was planned for 2019 but never came to fruition. All historic information divulged and documented on this audio file can be verified on history.com.